K-pop, K-drama, K-movie. Korean contents have raised global interest in all things Korean, including its language. For more on this trend, I have Professor Lee Kyu-tak from George Mason University, Korea. Welcome to the program, Professor Lee.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, thank you. I also have Professor Krista Chem Saitong from Hanyang University. It is a pleasure to have you here, Professor Chem Saitong.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right. Meanwhile, joining this session virtually is Professor Jae Song at the University of Melbourne in Australia. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Song.
Thanks for having me, Sunny.
Right, we'll start here in the studio then. Professor Lee, do you believe the popularity of Korea's cultural contents is fueling global interest in its language as well?
Yeah, actually, I've been teaching my Korean courses, which is about K-pop, Korean culture, Hallyu, and Korean contemporary society in an American university located in Songdo. And actually, many American students who have decided to study in the university is a big fan of like K-pop, Hallyu, the K-dramas, and others. And when they enjoy all those Korean content, they also came to have interest in learning Korean language, Korean history, and other Korean culture rather than Korean pop culture and Korean contemporary society. So yeah, that is the very big thing for them to learn all those Korean language to understand more about what they love as K-pop, Korean culture, Hallyu thing. And yeah, this is the very interesting situation that we are witnessing.
Right, it is really interesting. And Professor Song, I hear many Australian universities are now offering Korean language courses. Do tell us a bit about this trend. And do you suppose the popularity of Korean contents like Squid Game perhaps is behind it?
Oh, absolutely. Over the past 5 to 10 years, the number of students taking Korean language classes have increased dramatically. And now all the major universities in Australia are offering Korean language, culture, history, and politics subject at an undergraduate level. For example, at the University of Melbourne, where I'm based at the moment, when I joined the university in 2017, there was no subject on Korea at all. But I see there was a huge student demand for learning Korean language, as you said, thanks to K-pop and K-drama, K-food, K-fashion, and esports amongst young people across different nationalities and ethnicities. So especially in Melbourne, Blackpink is a big thing, as Rose and Jennie, the two members of the group, are from this part of the world. And Rose has a lovely Aussie accent, of course. So we opened our first Korean language class, Korean 1, in 2019. And the number of students was close to 500 and overtaking Chinese 1. So we are all very overwhelmed by the massive student interest in Korean language classes. And it's same everywhere, not just in Australia, but in North and Latin America, Europe, and especially Southeast Asia, we see the same trend that is K-pop leading other K-contents industry, but also Korean studies overseas as well. Starting with the Korean language at the beginner's level in big numbers, so quantity really matters. So what we really need to look at now is the quality. So in other words, whether these young students who initially started their interest in K-pop and language can move actually up to upper levels of Korean language and deeper understanding of Korea, including its history, politics, and society. So it is happening, which is good news, but it is not happening at the same speed as K-pop.
Right. Now, Professor Song just mentioned Blackpink. One of the members, Lisa, I believe Professor Chem Saitong is from Thailand, right?
Yes.
Now, you've been living here in Korea for about a decade, and you've since become a naturalized citizen. Could you tell us a bit about your personal journey and interest in the country?
Sure. So I became interested in Korean and set out to study it since the get-go, from the time I came to Korea. And first of all, by training and by nature, I am a linguist, and I always have a lifelong interest in language studies. And Korean provides interesting examples and counterexamples of linguistic phenomena that I have never seen in other languages that I know. And the second motivation is more on the transactional and functional side. With no knowledge of the local language, I found myself relying on other people's assistance to get things done in the most mundane way. For example, ordering things on the internet. But with some degree of proficiency, I now am able to do it on my own and have autonomy in what I want to accomplish and have accomplished for me. And in addition to that, there is a social motivation to studying Korean as well. So I also want to socialize with people. I also want to tell jokes and connect with people. So in this regard, Korean serves as a social lubricant that smooths out social interaction and fosters interpersonal relations. So because of these motivations, I voluntarily enrolled in Korean language classes at the institution where I currently work. And upon the first year of my arrival, and it's a daily 5-hour class, and with classmates from all over the world, all of whom were mostly younger than me. And there are 6 levels altogether, and each level takes about 2.5 months with exams and also classroom activities. I progressed through level 5, which translated to operational command of the language and the ability to handle some unfamiliar aspects of life like politics, economics, and society and culture. So even though my formal education for the formal side has ended, now my learning experience still continues by being immersed in the Korean culture.
I see. Did you first become interested in Korean culture owing to its, for example, movies or music?
Yes, a certain part of it, but that was a long time ago in the 90s, the late 90s, when, Daejanggeum, for example, was a big hit in Asia.
Right, Daejanggeum. Professor Chen Saitong, how do you compare the global interest in the Korean language now to perhaps 10 years ago?
Sure, that's an interesting question and at the same time difficult to answer precisely. The global interest certainly can be measured using many different parameters. To name but a few, one indicator is the number of King Sejong Institutes, which is the language center operated by the South Korean government. When the network was launched in 2017, there were only 13 centers in 3 countries, but by 2019, there were 172 centers in 56 countries, and in 2020, the network expanded even further with 213 institutes in 76 countries, and the number is expected to go up in 2021 and 22. Another indicator is the number of students taking formal Korean classes around the world. At the university level, Korean uptake in American universities was on the rise by about 15% between 2015 and 17, while overall enrollment in other languages was in decline. And globally, there were almost more than 1,500 universities in over 100 countries offering Korean classes as of 2017. So there's a huge decrease in comparison to the late 90s when there were only 152 universities in 32 countries. And at the elementary and secondary school levels, we also see the same phenomenon, a huge rise in students studying Korean, taking Korean classes. And in Thailand, we have the highest number of secondary school students taking Korean class in comparison to the rest of the world. And another indicator yet is the number of those taking state-run tests of proficiency in Korean topic. And in 2019, the number of test takers went up to almost 400,000, and that's an all-time high, indicating growth in the number of committed learners of the Korean language.
So the facts and statistics also show that there is a growing interest in the countries in the Korean language.
Yes, surely it does. And the spread of Korean is not only to be taken lightly, especially considering the fact that it has occurred within the span of only 2 decades.
I see. Quite impressive there then. Professor Yi, do you suppose Korea's cultural contents have served to perhaps boost awareness of Korea on the international arena?
Yes, of course. Actually, if you are Korean and if you have been in any other countries outside Korea, and you will be asked by the foreigners that, do you know K-pop? Do you know like other girl groups or girl band or the name of like BTS, Twice, Blackpink, and others? And maybe you do not know much about them, but still they are wondering that they will believe that you should know them, right? And they will ask about some Korean TV series or Korean TV shows and others. It means that they come to know about Korea, especially South Korea, by like enjoying Korean pop culture, mostly K-pop and other Korean dramas and Korean films. An interesting thing I can see is that although South Korea has achieved some like very rapid and significant economic achievement, like since the 1970s till the early and mid 1990s, and now you know that Korea is one of the like top 10 ranking country among the rank of the economic the economic development. But interesting thing is that they do not know much about Korean culture, including history. They only know about like South Korea and North Korea, their conflict or some political issues or some others rather than other things. But now many like global audience come to know like Korea other than all those political issues. by enjoying those Korean cultures, which is a very great thing for like branding Korean names overseas.
Right, its image as well then.
Right.
Professor Song, what would you say are the broader implications of Korean becoming a more commonly understood language?
Well, I'm not surprised by the significant increase in the number of topic takers. We should not consider this as a big success of a government-led soft power. I see this more of a driven by South Korea's growing economic power, as Professor Lee just mentioned, and its growing influence in the world economy. South Korea is now the world's 10th largest economy. Learning Korean and is becoming increasingly more important for businesses and trades. And at the same time, Korean language learning and teaching create jobs. So it also adds on to those sort of economic benefits of learning Korean language and teaching as well. More than a decade ago, an academic called Janice Diali-Matten said soft power without hard power is not a power. And Joseph Nye himself has amended the term to smart power. So soft power alone, the K-pop and the content industry is itself, it cannot make all these progresses in numeric terms. So it also connected to other material and hard power base supporting this sort of soft image and identity of South Korea.
Right. Professor Song, you mentioned soft power. Do you suppose the soft power or the smart power that you said generated by Korea's cultural contents perhaps allows the country to punch above its weight on the international arena?
Oh, I think at the beginning, the sort of South Korean government-led, the Ministry of Culture has a huge role in promoting Korean cultural product and the content industry and overseas. But I think it's beyond that stage now where, you know, the private actors and these young people, I think the youth power is really a significant factor and playing an important role in spreading, you know, the various and diverse images and identities on different parts of cultures of Korea. At the moment. So it's not, it's better when it's driven by the people themselves rather than driven by the government initiatives.
Right. And staying with that, Professor Cham Sai-tong, what are the implications of this global interest in Korean for Korea as a country?
So for Korea as a country, first of all, we know that, you know, the relationship between language and culture, right? That the effects of the global spread of Korean and the awareness of Korea on the global scale. So certainly one affects the other. So I can offer one powerful piece of evidence. And most recently in 2021, 26 words were formally accepted into the Oxford English Dictionary, which is held as the definitive record of the English language. And it is unprecedented that this many words are added from one language within a year. So we have new food-related entries such as bulgogi, thin slices of beef or pork, or jimek, Korean-style chicken and beer. Other culturally specific words are also added. For example, hanbok, the formal attire, the traditional attire. Most surprising to me are the words like skinship, which captures the emotional and physical contact between two people, ekkyo, a kind of cuteness or charm characteristically Korean, and finally daebak, for example, fantastic or amazing. So of course the word hallyu is also included. So the inclusion of these widely used Korean words testify to the fact that some aspects of Korean culture at least have spread beyond the borders into the global mainstream, and the fact that these cultural aspects have become part of the mainstream global culture.
Right. One of my favorite words there is mukbang.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Professor, how can Korean content, that is, serve to make most of their leverage, perhaps, to keep or to offer greater access to the Korean language itself?
When I think about my days when I tried to learn other languages such as English or even Japanese, the thing that I did is to watch US TV series or listen to Japanese pop music or watch Japanese films. And it was a very great opportunity for me to know not the the grammars or all the sentences or the expressions that only will be used very officially. But in those cultural content, I could learn all those everyday expressions that many people in the United States or in Japan actually use in their everyday life, right? And when you enjoy K-pop or Korean TV series or other Korean cultural content, I believe that it will provide a great opportunity for those who try to learn Korean culture and Korean language by enjoying all those Korean like TV series or Korean films or K-pop, and know that the TV series will give all those like the great examples that how all those languages is actually used among people living in Korea, right? So I think it is very, great things for people who try to learn Korean language, then they enjoy Korean culture, then they will get a great opportunity to learn all those Korean language more, faster and easier.
Right, and speaking about learning, Professor Chem Sai-tong, as a scholar who has studied both English and Korean, what can you share with us about your experience in learning these two very different languages?
Okay, certainly there are differences in my learning experiences. However, some of these are more or less unplanned and opportunistic, making a head-to-head comparison challenging. For example, I started learning English at a relatively young age while I am an adult Korean learner. So the quantity and quality of the input available to me as a learner is not on a par with my previous experience. In terms of language acquisition, the younger one is less effort, time, or commitment it takes to acquire a language. And in addition, I have spent 30 plus years studying and researching the English language while I have been exposed to Korea for about 10 years or so. So there's a big gap and a huge difference there. But on the positive side, my prior education and acquisition of other languages may have positive effects on learning Korean. Throughout the years, I have accumulated a great deal of meta language, that is, those terms that I use to talk about language itself, like the passive voice, verbs, adjectives, and that kind of thing. So that linguistic awareness facilitates my Korean learning to a great extent.
Right. Professor Song, how does access to the Korean language compare to that of the Chinese and Japanese languages? And perhaps what efforts do you advise to maintain this global interest in Korean?
Yeah, I know, it's just amazing. The students sometimes approach me asking about what the meaning of 정, 한, or 눈치, right? So that should be also included in the next version of the Oxford Dictionary, perhaps. Where Korean language at the beginner's level is already overtaking Chinese. In Australia, and especially where I'm based in Melbourne, Japanese language is still the dominant Asian language a lot of students want to learn. They've been teaching Japanese for more than 100 years. And in this regard, Korea is 100 years behind Japan in terms of language teaching overseas. The Confucius Institution on the Chinese language side has been teaching the language, but it actually backfires because it's understood as driven by the CCP or understood as a foreign influence. From what I experienced as a professor teaching Korea in Australia, what really fascinates young people beyond K-pop and language is Korean history and contemporary social issues such as gender-based violence, like the anti-feminism growing, and Lee Jun-seok, youth suicide and unemployment issues, and North Korea and the peace on the Korean Peninsula. So I have students approaching me also asking about, what they want to study about comfort women issue, Park Jung-hee's era's economic development in the 60s, and also 60s film director Lee Man-hee, who I've never heard of. So students' interest in Korean language and K-pop is really going beyond that sort of a beginner stage at the moment. So they want to learn about, what's happening on the DMZ and the North Korean defector crossing the border to the north side. So this is where the next K-contents need to work on from now on, in my perspective.
Right, and staying with that, beyond language then, Professor, what do you believe is the next level for Korea's content makers to further boost their international standing?
Actually, there are many things, of course, but among others, I would like to point out two things. One thing is that now Korean culture is, being enjoyed by like global audience, which means that in the past, many like Korean creators who have produced great Korean content actually did not really think about the possibility that their culture will be enjoyed overseas. So it means that TV series, K-pop, or other like Korean TV shows, variety shows, what they try to do is to satisfy the very demand from local audience, the Korean audience. But now it is enjoyed by like global audience, and even many like producers still do not really expect that their product will be enjoyed by like not only by East Asian audience, not only by American audience, but like for example, audience from Central Asia, Africa, North Africa, or Middle East, which has a very which exists. There is a kind of the very cultural difference between them, right? So we should think about that all Korean culture will be enjoyed by others. So what we try to do is to not only think about like what we are going to like show, but what our culture will be enjoyed by like the global audience. So the Korean culture will include all those like the consideration about the cultural differences. And the next thing is that we should like guarantee the artistic freedom, which means that the reason that Korean culture can be developed like this is to guarantee all those artistic freedom that producers can make what they wanted to make, right? But now there is a kind of many like sensitive issues such as political issues or the economic issues of like gender issues, which may become a kind of big barrier for all those artistic producers to create what they really want. And it can be a kind of the obstacle also for the global audience that they love what Korean culture have expressed very freely, what they may not love the culture produced in a very limited environment.
Right,
So,
it needs to branch out, be
Yeah.
more diverse, and
Right.
perhaps address universal issues.
Right, true. So we also should consider this issue as well.
Right, we should. All right, Professor Yi, thank you very much for your thoughts today. Professor Sung over in Australia, thank you very much for being with us. And Professor Chem Sai Tong here in the studio as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.